area. That's really great to see. So as Erica said, I am the Climate Resiliency Project Manager for the Mystic Watershed, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm going to start us off by making sure to ground us in the lands that we are occupying. And so we at the Mystic River Watershed would like to honor and acknowledge the indigenous lands of the Wampanoag and Massachusetts and any other communities that are Native and First Nations of this region in the past, present, and future. What I'll be touching upon today is our role at the Mystic in environmental and climate justice, focusing on climate resilience, how historical public policy decisions affect our current climate impacts and those who are most vulnerable within our watershed, and the resiliency projects and what our vision is for the folks who are most vulnerable or our priority populations. And so I think that we have all seen the various headlines of climate change and our future and present climate conditions in the Boston area. And I think this is a lot of information that we know. We know that there are more hot days in Boston. We're experiencing that now. We know that there's lots of extreme precipitation, meaning lots of water in one time, creating lots of flooding, and also lots of flooding from sea level rise. As you can see within this map is the border of our watershed and the varying degrees of coastal flooding. But those are some of the things that you may already know. There's lots of conversations about that, but within the Mystic River and as an environmental organization, we want to move beyond focusing on only the environmental conditions and only the infrastructure conditions of climate impacts, but we also want to look at who is more vulnerable to climate change compared to other folks. And the way that we're doing that is understanding what vulnerability is. So let's just step back and understand why some folks are more vulnerable than others. And that relates to exposure, sensitivity, and the adaptive capacity of a person. Adaptive capacity meaning how can they bounce forward? How can they move past whatever impact they've had in their lives? And so if we can all think about the moment that we're in right now due to COVID-19, the pandemic, if we think about our neighbors, we can think about the folks who are being disproportionately impacted right now. And those folks are those who will likely be most impacted by climate change in the future and who are also being impacted now, potentially even without their knowledge. And so there's lots of barriers and there's lots of root causes to these discrepancies. And so that relates to racism, different degrees of income, different degrees of living conditions. Perhaps you're older and more vulnerable. Perhaps you have underlying health conditions. Perhaps there's a language barrier. And so these are all things that can impact people differently within our watershed. And so within our watershed, we have different degrees of resiliency. Some people are more exposed than others. So some people may live right on the coastal floodplains. Some people may be older and are more sensitive to heat. And some people can perhaps not afford to adapt to the increases in heat waves or afford to move out of harm's way or afford to make their homes more heat or flood resilient. So how did we get to these varying degrees of climate vulnerability, and what are those varying degrees, and how can then we move forward and help protect each other, help protect our neighbors to get out of harm's way and become more resilient to climate? So first, we're really, for Myra, Mystic River, we have to acknowledge as an environmental organization that is some level of historical trauma, ancestral BIPOC, meaning Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and how that ties to the present moment and how that ties to specifically land and the environment. And let me just walk us through this a little bit for me to explain what this means. And so I will give you an example, and if I can't go and talk about environmental justice work without talking about Hazel M. Johnson, who is known as the mother of environmental justice. And she came out during the 1970s to research why her neighborhood in the south side of Chicago had the highest cancer rates in the area. And she did some research. She uncovered that there was that her housing project was built on a toxic landfill, and it directly contributed to the high cancer rates of men, women, and children in that area. And so this then created a movement of people who needed to look into how the environment was negatively impacting them out of necessity. And if we go back a little bit further, we also have to uncover and decolonize some of the things that we are taught. For example, there's lots of people who are forgotten in history, such as John Edmonstone, and I'm sure some folks are some bird lovers out there. I am a birder myself, but I have never learned of John Edmonstone until I learned of environmental, or I took an environmental justice class. And so he was a freed American slave who received training in ornithology and taxidermy, and then taught this knowledge to Charles Darwin. And then the tale goes that he influenced Darwin to actually go on the trip to Galapagos, which then, as we all know, led to the origin of the species, or of our evolutionary theory. And so us as an organization, we have to acknowledge the ancestral trauma that is within BIPOC communities, again, Black, Indigenous, people of color, which means that we individually have to step back and uncover some of the truths that we hold dear. For example, this is me looking really tired on the left on the John Muir Trail in Yosemite. This was almost 8 years ago, before my summer of going into graduate school, and I was really happy to be on the John Muir Trail. He's a huge conservationist, and was really excited to spend a week-long backpacking trip through that trail. And on the right is me doing some of my master's thesis work in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, and doing coral reef and what I didn't know at the time, that these were actually the lands of the Awanichi and the lands of the Tainos, and that actually John Muir took a lot of these lands from Indigenous folks and did not allow people of color to go within these lands. Similarly, with the West Indies, this area was then blended by the Spaniards and other European folks with African slaves, and with the Taino populations. And so this was all history that I had to uncover for myself in order to really understand how different generations hold this space, and then how it impacts our life today and how it impacts the BIPOC communities today. And so if we come back to the Mystic and we focus in Boston, we have several clues to understand how folks are impacted differently by flooding and by heat and other extreme events. And so one clue that we have is that marshes do remember where they are. And if you look at the red area or the pink and orange areas, those are projected flooding zones of downtown Boston. And then if we overlay this map of pre-colonial times, we can see that this area that is shown in pink was actually the Boston Harbor. It used to be covered by water. It used to be marshlands. And so we have built areas on top of the ocean, and as the sea level rises and as there is more extreme precipitation, the ocean tries to go back to where it came from. And so I'll show you again. That is where the flooding occurs in downtown Boston. And so there are policy decisions that were made to invest in these areas and cover these salt marsh areas and create land where there was no land before. And flood maps were not the only clue. We also must acknowledge the racist policies that is now termed redlining in the Boston area in the 1930s. And so if you're unfamiliar with this, the government, along with housing associations, basically put lines around immigrant communities into neighborhoods of immigrant communities. And you can see that in the red and yellow areas, those were deemed definitely declining and hazardous, and those were the groups that were denied homeowner loans and small business loans. And in the areas of blue and green, those were areas that were the best areas that folks could invest in, be given loans. And so how that affects our watershed today is really telling. And so here is an updated map that includes our watershed and the area that we have data for redlining. And you can see that the areas of Revere, Malden, Everett, Charlestown, Somerville, and East Boston were areas that were deemed definitely declining and hazardous within our watershed. And that is our lower watershed that is known to be more lower income. And if we look at heat exposure for our watershed, we can see that in the lower part of the Mystic, in the same areas that were redlined, the surface air temperature is hotter. So it's basically hotter in the areas that were not well invested in and that were communities of color and immigrants. And so this shows us that these policy decisions of the past are still affecting our present communities within the watershed. Additionally, we can see here that this is a low-income housing unit in East Boston. And what's particularly notable about this housing complex is that it was built during the time of lots of pollution. If you're old enough to remember the Charles River, the Mystic River, the Boston Harbor used to be extremely polluted. You know, people would joke that, or actually be serious, that if you fell in the river, you should really go to the hospital, to the emergency room. And these low-income houses were built right on that area where the water quality was poor. And what you can see is that there were no windows facing the water. So, you know, just out of sight, out of mind, let's put the folks who are low income in these poor areas. That has changed, right? Because there now there's a lot of investment, especially if we think of in certain areas of Boston, of waterfront communities. And why is that? Does it relate to the fact that now the harbor is cleaned up? And so now there are decisions made of investing in these communities. And so even though the risks are the same for the folks living here in these luxury condos as here, the folks who live here have different levels of resources, right? And so what can we do about this? How can we move past this inequity? And so here we are trying to create a resilience approach that is going beyond municipal boundaries. And so our group has started the Resilient Mystic Collaborative, the RMC, that tries to create climate resilience while talking with each other, right? Since we don't necessarily have an effective county government, we are using this Watershed Association to do that. So we're 21 communities, one watershed. One of our projects is to storm harden our critical infrastructure, which is the Amelia Earhart Dam, oil terminals, the metro, the New England Food Produce Center, which is the area where all our produce comes in for all of New England, and the Logan Airport. So without this critical infrastructure, it would be really hard for us to have our basic needs met, right? But we're also remembering people. So we're focusing on infrastructure, and we're trying to focus on those who are most vulnerable. So one of the projects for understanding how this critical infrastructure is impacted by flooding is understanding who will be impacted if the Amelia Earhart Dam floods, who will be impacted the most if the oil terminals flood and there's oil in our river and in our bay. And for this work, we have hired the consultant team led by Dr. Atia Martin from All ACEs. She was the first resilience chief officer of Boston. And we have been awarded a grant by the state to cover this work and are able to then pay community-based organizations who are doing all of the groundwork, especially right now during the pandemic, such as La Comunidad in Everett, such as Green Roots, who've been doing lots of great social environmental justice work for a long time in Chelsea and East Boston, and Harbor Keepers of East Boston, who's been doing a lot of advocacy work. And so this is going back to our representation matters. Nuance is critical in understanding the needs of the community. We, you know, it's easy to say, oh, well, the low-income folks need funds, they need food, but what kind of resources do they need? What kind of produce, you know, do they need? How can they be more resilient? How can they connect with each other so that they are more able to withstand a storm or a high heat event? In terms of heat, we are working with the Museum of Science through funding from the state as well to create a mapping tool to map the urban heat islands within our watershed. And so urban heat islands are areas typically within cities that are much hotter than greener areas outside of the city. And so this is an extension of a project that the Museum of Science did for Boston, where they used these probes that they put on top of cars using citizen scientists and did transects all around Boston to measure the air temperature within the area on a really hot day during a heat wave. And so we're going to expand that throughout the watershed to understand what areas are cool, what areas are hotter than expected, who are the communities here, using this as an educational opportunity also so that the community who is most vulnerable to heat also knows their risks and knows the communities that they can reach out to. We also understand that it's proven to be much more cost-effective to ask the community what their needs are first to ensure that there's climate resiliency and safety. So this is involving in planning for different renovations of parks, for new investments. How can we involve the community so that we do this the right way from the beginning? And so one of those projects is reducing the heat island effects, particularly in Malden, by creating parks along the river called the Mystic Greenways. And so this project has been extremely well attended and well attended by the community of Malden because we have involved them right from the beginning. And so we've created a steering committee that is full of citizens and people of color and environmental justice advocates from Malden. And we were able to have 2 in-person meetings before the pandemic, and our 2 public meetings that were virtual were extremely well attended, and especially for a virtual meeting. And so that really shows us that this group is committed to ensuring the renovation of the park and how that relates to flood and how that relates to heat resilience and how that connects to also gaining a better awareness of the river and of the resources that are within the area. We're also in the works of renovating the areas around the Little Mystic Channel, which is in Charlestown. And we're working with the community who lives right adjacent to the Little Mystic Channel to understand what their needs are. And this is particularly to affordable housing communities. And so they will be the direct beneficiaries of the upgrades to the Little Mystic Channel area. And so ensuring that we hear from them first is critical. And also, again, it serves as a tool to make them aware and make them more resilient against extreme temperatures. And we're also working with the city of Chelsea to create a restoration of a salt marsh at Island End. And Island End River borders Chelsea and Everett. And so we're working with the community members, specifically of Chelsea, who work or live there, and of Everett, to create this renovation of the salt marsh or restoration of the salt marsh and the renovation of the park that goes around it. We had a great kickoff socially distanced cleanup event earlier, or I guess late last month. And that was really well attended by members of the community to again get them involved and for them to learn of their climate impacts and how that affects their daily life through their jobs. And lastly, we have also, well, I would be remiss if I didn't mention any lessons that we have learned from this pandemic. And so one of them is definitely that collaboration and coordination is key. And so this is at all levels, right? And so it's important to have collaboration and coordination among the state and local government in order to deploy resources to the community and for them to understand what the needs are. And it's also important to have that among community organizations who know the members the best, and also and also people, neighbors knowing neighbors. Think about any neighbors that you have in your community who you know perhaps live alone, who maybe have children, who maybe do or don't have air conditioning, who maybe live on a floodplain. And so knowing each other creates the greatest resilience. And so this summer, Mystic River joined the Metropolitan Area Planning Council in helping the Bar Foundation to distribute emergency funding for those communities who have been most affected by COVID and who have highest heat vulnerability. And so on the left, we see Chelsea Green Roots. The city of Chelsea and Green Roots have, they came up with a project to install hydration stations in important areas in Chelsea. And so this will create hydration in the long run, created longer term infrastructure for that community. So people have the ability to stay hydrated during high heat events. And on the right, we see Gail of the Boston area who's receiving air conditioner and electricity bill help support. And there's been lots of folks who've said that they have really benefited from this. And especially the older folks who need it the most during these times. And again, I cannot stress enough how important it is to really know your neighbors, to understand who is most in need within your community. How can you extend the community, and how then you yourself or others can help support this effort. And with that, I'll be happy to take questions. I see there's a couple of questions already. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Great. And so if Erica, you can help me with the questions, that would be great.
Absolutely. And just so you know, we are going to download all of the questions. So if we're unable to get to yours, for example, we will be able to answer that in a blog afterwards, and we'll get that to you. But I'll help you manage the questions. Melanie, would you like to start with Rachel Wagner's? So it's, how can we be sure to involve the community in times of virtual gatherings where tech and Wi-Fi is required, but it's possibly inaccessible for the communities who we want to hear?
Sure, hold on one second.
No
on my computer. So how can we be sure to involve the community in times of virtual gatherings where technology Wi-Fi is required but possibly inaccessible? Yes, so That is a question that we have definitely struggled with and found answers to. And so for some folks who need low tech support, it really does have to be something that starts off as socially distanced, but in person, making sure that you're taking the right safety precautions. If that is not available, picking up the phone and doing a regular low tech phone call is really helpful, and walking through that process with them. Whatever technology tool you're using, like Zoom, or maybe it's just video, and yeah, using all of that and just knowing that it will just take significantly more time to hear from those communities, because you need to make this extra investment in time and patience. And then,
Melanie, could you talk about the Charlestown event and how that worked engaging people?
yeah, so as I mentioned, we're looking to renovate the areas around the Little Mystic Channel in Charlestown. And for that community, we really needed input from them, but it's mostly people who need a lot of technical support. And so we decided to do a socially distanced survey opportunity. And we worked with the community outreach person who leads the outreach efforts for that housing complex. And we're able to schedule blocks of time for people to go to their courtyard and fill out a paper survey outside. And so they have a pretty big courtyard, and we set up tables outside. We had, all of the masks and hand sanitizers, and people were able to come take a paper survey. Only 15 people could take it within a time in this area that was pretty spread out. And then they were able to get compensation for their time and for their input. And so that was really effective because we worked with the community outreach coordinator. She knew the community. I don't know them personally. And they were able to provide Cantonese translation because this community is Cantonese speaking. And we were also able to provide a second translator. And so most of the event was in Cantonese, with the exception of us saying hello and thank you so much and please stay healthy. So that was a huge success. We had about 70 people, and again, socially distance, and only 15 people at a time. So that is just an example of what you can do. And again, it just takes a bit more time to make those connections, to make sure that the event runs smoothly.
Thank you, Melanie. That event was fascinating, and it was all in Cantonese, right? Most of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Well, our next question, as you're engaging with the Lower Mystic community, what environmental issues are coming up the most? Like, what have you noticed of there being a pattern about what people are most concerned about?
Sure, that's a really good question. In terms of environmental issues, people are really worried about the pollution they can see. And so, there's trash within the water, etc. But it is harder for the community to take the leap and understand that of the invisible threats, such as poor air quality because of more hot days and how that condenses the air, and the pollution that is nearby due to the airport, due to factories being in the Lower Mystic, and there being more impervious areas where there's a lot of runoff into the water column. And so again, I would say that the pollution they can see is really prevalent, but those that they cannot see is harder to pin down on, and that's the connection that we are trying to make.
Thank you, Melanie. So our next one, this is a really great question. Can you describe the connection between being a watershed association and focusing on vulnerable or priority populations?
Yes. So we are a Watershed Association. We are trying to make sure that we protect and conserve the area where our river flows through, and this includes the lower Mystic population. This includes the folks who live within the watershed, who have highest threats to flooding, the highest threats to impacts from the urban heat island effect. And so we want to connect people to our to the Mystic River, and we want people to enjoy it. And we also want to make sure that people understand how to be as safe as possible and as resilient as possible throughout these climate impacts.
Thank you. All right, so our next question, can you speak to the balance between creating parks and more green infrastructure, but then the potential downside of greening that's often associated with gentrification and increased property values?
Sure, so I think that this is relating to the term green gentrification. So areas that, you know, if you create this really beautiful park or if you clean up this area, then it will increase the property values and will actually gentrify the area. And so this is a difficult matter, definitely, and something that we are trying to avoid within any of our projects. And so I'll say two of the ways that we're trying to make sure that green gentrification or climate gentrification does not occur is we are, one, working with the community on our projects right from the beginning. And so they have the investment, they are connected to the city officials who are working on these projects. We also are in Charlestown again, working with areas that are, or creating park areas next to affordable housing, which are areas that, you know, will maintain the correct, distracted. And so we're working with the affordable housing units department to make sure that green gentrification does not happen.
Thank you. All right, I think we have time for one more question, and this is in regards to lower income housing. How do we incorporate these principles of resiliency when we're advocating for vulnerable communities with local developers?
Yeah, definitely. So I think one of the ways that we can incorporate these principles is, again, working with those community members to make sure that they have the voice and they have the connection so that they are speaking for themselves, for one, because they do have a voice, they do need that bridge. And so I think it's really important to make sure that we are not speaking necessarily in place of the those who are the priority populations necessarily, but creating the bridge so that they feel empowered, so they have the right connections, they know who to call, and really bridge that gap. And sometimes a fractured relationship with whatever, officials there are, such as city officials, such as the different property owners. And if in the case where they don't feel comfortable enough to be able to speak on their own behalf, making sure that we understand their points of view, their necessities, what their needs are, and then bring that to the forefront. But again, it's really making sure to take the time. It just takes a bit more time to foster these relationships with the community. If I bring up Charlestown, again, it took about a year for us to really connect to the community in order to get to the spot where we could have the trust to have an event within their space, and especially during this very vulnerable time of COVID, to make sure that they felt comfortable enough with us and connected to the community. And then I see one question that is asking, how can people be involved in the Wicked Hot Mystic project? So that's a great question. Between Erica and I, if you stay tuned to get our emails for being a volunteer, we will be doing some of that work in the late winter and early spring, calling for volunteers for the Citizen Science Project. And so again, you can just stay tuned when we start to put out that information. And so that will happen late winter, early spring, when we put out the recruitment for that, and then move forward in the summertime to actually do that data collection and then do the output. So I hope that some of you listening today would be involved.
Thank you so much, Melanie.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, thank you all for joining as well. I just wanted to reiterate that we will answer any questions that we didn't get to via a blog on our website. And if you would like to rewatch any part of this webinar with Melanie, there is a recording on our Facebook page, so that is there as well. But thank you, Melanie. Thank you, everyone, for joining. If you're here on the policy committee, you will be starting at 8, and there is the separate meeting registration link. Otherwise, I hope you have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye. See ya.